They say the worst betrayals come from family, that the deepest cuts are made by those who claim to love you most. But there's something even worse than being betrayed by blood being used by it. In the space between midnight and dawn, when the world holds its breath and secrets spill like blood in snow, two strangers will collide, one running from a truth too terrible to speak, the other hiding from a past too painful to remember. By morning, 12 black vehicles will surround them. Armed men will demand answers to questions that shouldn't exist, and a dying woman's 40-year empire will tremble on the edge of collapse. Because sometimes salvation comes disguised as catastrophe. And sometimes the only way to expose a lie that's killed thousands is to trust a stranger in the snow. The wind howled through the skeletal branches of Vermont's winter landscape like the whispered confessions of ghosts. Snow fell in thick, relentless sheets, blanketing the small town of Millbrook in a silence so profound it seemed the world had stopped breathing. Frank Sullivan sat hunched over a bowl of lukewarm chili in what used to be the customer waiting area of Sullivan's Auto Repair. The neon sign outside had flickered its last breath 3 winters ago, but Frank hadn't bothered to replace it. These days, word of mouth was enough. The few customers who still came knew to knock on the side door and wait for the shuffle of his work boots across the oil-stained concrete. At 65, Frank carried the weight of decades in his shoulders, not just from years bent over engine blocks, but from the invisible burden of a life that had taken too many wrong turns. His hands, stained permanently with grease that no amount of scrubbing could remove, trembled slightly as he raised the spoon to his lips. Not from age, but from the memory that never left him alone, especially on nights like this when the wind sounded too much like the roar of rocket engines. The wood stove in the corner cast dancing shadows across walls lined with automotive calendars from years past, their pages yellowed and curling at the edges. This wasn't a home, it was a retreat, a place where a man could disappear from the world that had already forgotten him. Then came the knock. It wasn't the confident rap of a stranded motorist or the urgent hammering of someone with car trouble. This was hesitant, almost apologetic, the sound of someone who didn't want to disturb but had run out of choices. Frank set down his spoon and listened. Outside, the wind continued its relentless assault, but there it was again. 3 soft taps, barely audible above the storm. He stood slowly, his joints protesting the movement, and walked to the small window that looked out toward the side of the building. Through the frost-covered glass, he could make out a figure hunched against the elements. A woman, her dark coat dusted white with snow, standing beside the small storage shed he used for old parts. Frank grabbed his heavy coat from the hook by the door and stepped outside. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and sending a shock through his system that reminded him he wasn't as young as he used to be. "Hello," he called out, his voice barely carrying over the wind. The figure turned, and Frank saw a face that spoke of desperation wearing the mask of dignity. She was perhaps 50, with graying hair plastered to her head by the snow and eyes that held the particular exhaustion that comes from running too long with nowhere to go. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice steady despite the chattering of her teeth. "I don't mean to trespass. I saw your light, and I wondered if I might wait out the storm in your shed. I can pay." Frank studied her for a moment. She wasn't dressed like someone who belonged on the streets. Her coat was expensive, her boots well-made but scuffed from hard travel. The bag she clutched to her chest looked like it contained everything she owned, but it was the kind of laptop bag executives carried, not the worn duffel of someone accustomed to homelessness. "Storm's getting worse," Frank said, glancing up at the sky where snow fell like static against the darkness. "That shed's not heated. You'll freeze before morning." The woman's shoulders sagged slightly. "I understand. I just thought—" "I've got a couch inside," Frank interrupted. "Coffee's hot, and there's more chili if you're hungry." She blinked at him through the snow, as if the offer was so unexpected she couldn't quite process it. "You don't know me." "No," Frank agreed, "but I know what it's like to be out in the cold." Something in his tone, a recognition that transcended the immediate moment, seemed to reach her. She nodded once. a sharp movement that spoke of a decision made against all rational thought. "Thank you," she said simply. Frank led her inside, noting how she moved alert, constantly scanning, like someone who had learned not to trust safety even when it was offered. He poured coffee into a clean mug and ladled chili into a bowl, setting both on the small table he used for paperwork. "I'm Frank," he said as she settled into the old recliner that served as his living room furniture. "Kate," she replied, then paused as if she'd said more than she intended. Kate Morrison. The name hung in the air between them, and Frank saw something flicker across her face, regret, perhaps, or fear at having revealed too much. But Frank had spent enough years running from his own name to recognize the weight of one that had become a burden. "Well, Kate Morrison," he said, settling into his work chair. "You're safe here until the storm passes." She wrapped her hands around the coffee mug, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why help me?" Frank considered the question, staring into his own coffee. Outside, the wind rattled the windows like an old friend demanding entry. "I suppose," he said finally, "because someone should have helped me once, and didn't." Kate studied his face in the dim light, reading something in the lines around his eyes that spoke of losses that couldn't be measured in dollars or years. She didn't ask what he meant, and Frank was grateful for her restraint. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the storm raging outside. Frank noticed that Kate never fully relaxed, never let go of the bag she'd carried in with her. Whatever was inside, it was precious enough to risk everything for. "You can rest," Frank said eventually. "I'll take the chair." Kate shook her head. "I couldn't. Lady, I've been sleeping in this chair for 3 years. One more night won't kill me." Something in her expression cracked then, just slightly, and Frank caught a glimpse of the woman beneath the fugitive. "Thank you," she whispered. As Kate settled onto the couch, still clutching her bag, Frank dimmed the lights and settled into his chair. He didn't sleep, hadn't slept well in years, but he kept watch, listening to the storm and the steady breathing of the stranger he'd invited into his sanctuary. He didn't know that by morning, his quiet life would be shattered. He didn't know that the woman on his couch carried secrets that could topple empires, or that her name was already being whispered in boardrooms, in government offices across New England. All Frank knew was that someone had needed help, and for the first time in a very long time, he'd been in a position to give it. It was enough. The morning arrived gray and muted, the storm having exhausted itself sometime before dawn. Frank woke to find Kate already awake, sitting on the edge of the couch and staring out the window with the focused attention of someone watching for wolves. "Coffee," Frank offered, but Kate held up a hand for silence. That's when Frank heard it, the low rumble of multiple engines growing closer, the crunch of tires on snow. He moved to the window and felt his blood turn to ice water. 12 black SUVs moved down the narrow road in perfect formation, their windows tinted so dark they looked like holes cut from reality itself. They moved with the precision of a military convoy, each vehicle maintaining exact spacing, their chrome grills gleaming like teeth in the pale morning light. "Jesus," Frank breathed. Kate had gone completely still beside him, her face drained of color. "They found me." The SUVs pulled to a stop in a semicircle around Frank's garage, their engines idling in synchronized menace. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, doors began opening in unison, disgorging men in dark suits who moved with the fluid coordination of professionals. One man separated himself from the group, tall, silver-haired, wearing a charcoal overcoat that probably cost more than Frank's truck. He approached the garage with the confident stride of someone accustomed to having doors open for him. Frank stepped outside before the man could knock, not wanting these strangers in his sanctuary. The cold morning air bit at his lungs, but he kept his expression neutral. "Mr. Sullivan," the man said, his voice carrying the cultured accent of old New England money. "I'm David Morrison, head of security for the Morrison Medical Foundation." The name hit Frank like a physical blow. Morrison Medical Foundation, one of the largest cancer research organizations in the country, Founded by the Morrison family fortune, built on pharmaceutical patents and medical devices, Frank had seen their name on hospital wings and research grants, had even donated his meager savings to them after. "We're looking for someone," Morrison continued. "A woman, mid-50s, dark hair. She may be confused, disoriented. She's been missing for 3 days." Frank kept his face carefully blank. "Haven't seen anyone like that." Morrison's smile was polite but cold. "Mrs. Catherine Morrison is my sister-in-law. She's been under considerable stress lately, the death of her husband, financial pressures. We're concerned for her mental health." "Like I said," Frank repeated, "haven't seen anyone." Behind Morrison, the other men waited with the patience of predators. Frank counted at least 15 of them, all carrying themselves with the bearing of ex-military or law enforcement. This wasn't a search party, it was a small army. Morrison reached into his coat and produced a business card. "If she does turn up, please call immediately. Kate isn't, well, she's been making accusations, spreading false information about the foundation. We just want to get her the help she needs." Frank took the card without looking at it. "Sure thing." Morrison studied Frank's face for a long moment, searching for cracks in his composure. Finding none, he nodded once and returned to his vehicle. The SUVs departed as smoothly as they'd arrived, leaving only tire tracks in the snow as evidence they'd ever been there. Frank waited until the sound of engines faded completely before returning inside. Kate stood by the window, her reflection ghostly in the glass. "They called you crazy," Frank said quietly. Kate turned to face him, and Frank saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there the night before, a fierce, burning anger that transformed her from fugitive to fighter. "Crazy," she repeated, tasting the word like poison. "That's their favorite weapon. Discredit the messenger, and no one listens to the message." Frank poured fresh coffee, his mind racing. "What message?" Kate looked at him for a long moment, weighing trust against desperation. Finally, she opened her bag and pulled out a slim laptop encased in a waterproof shell. "Frank," she said quietly, "what do you know about computer systems?" Frank almost laughed. "Lady, I can barely operate a smartphone." Kate's expression grew serious. "That man, David Morrison, he's not just my brother-in-law. He's the CEO of Morrison Medical Foundation. And he's been stealing money meant for cancer research." Frank felt the room tilt slightly around him. "What kind of money?" $1.8 billion, Kate said, her voice steady as steel. "Diverted from research grants, experimental treatments, drug trials, money that was supposed to save lives, funneled into real estate investments and offshore accounts." The words hung in the air like an accusation against the universe itself. Frank found himself thinking about the donation he'd made years ago, about all the desperate families who'd contributed their last dollars to the hope of a cure. "You have proof?" he asked. Kate nodded toward the laptop. "Digital audit trails, transaction records, authorization codes, enough to bring down the entire operation." She paused. "But there's a problem, which is, the data is incomplete. When they discovered what I'd found, they moved fast, cut off my access, froze my accounts, had me declared mentally incompetent. But they didn't know about the backup system." Frank's interest sharpened. "What backup system?" Kate's expression grew distant. "My husband, Michael, he was paranoid about data security. Before he died, he helped me create a shadow archive system, completely separate from the Foundation's main servers. The full records are stored on a secure server at Harvard, where Michael used to teach." "Harvard," Frank repeated. "That's, what, 2 hours from here. If we can get there without being caught." Kate met his eyes. "Frank, I know this isn't your fight. You can walk away right now, and I won't blame you. But I need those records. Without them, everything I have is just accusations from a supposedly crazy woman." Frank stared at the laptop, thinking about the men in suits, about Morrison's cold smile, about the word crazy used as a weapon. He thought about all the people who trusted their money and their hope to an organization that had betrayed both. How do we get to Harvard? He asked. Relief flooded Kate's face. You'll help me. Frank stood and walked to a closet in the corner, pulling out a heavy duffel bag. Lady, I've spent the last 15 years hiding from the world. Maybe it's time I did something useful with what's left of my life. As Frank packed supplies into his battered pickup truck, Kate noticed something that made her pause. Tucked between road flares and jumper cables was a laminated ID badge, faded with age but still readable. NASA, Johnson Space Center, Franklin J. Sullivan, Senior Systems Engineer. You worked for NASA? Kate asked, holding up the badge. Frank's hand stilled on the toolkit he was loading. Long time ago. How long? Frank took the badge from her, running his thumb over the photo of a younger, more hopeful version of himself. I designed control systems for the space shuttle program, redundant safety protocols, backup navigation systems, stuff that was supposed to keep people alive when everything else went wrong. Kate felt pieces clicking into place. The laptop I showed you, you understood it better than you let on. Frank's laugh was bitter. I built systems like that. Multi-layered security, encrypted audit trails, digital signatures that couldn't be forged. Back when I still believed technology could be trusted to do the right thing. What happened? Frank tossed the badge back into the bag and resumed packing. January 28th, 1986. Challenger. He paused, his voice growing quiet. I wasn't on the O-ring team, but I was part of the group that certified the backup systems. When everything went wrong, the backups were supposed to give the crew a chance. Kate waited, sensing there was more. They did their job, Frank continued. The backups worked perfectly, but perfect isn't enough when the primary system fails catastrophically. 7 people died, and everyone wanted someone to blame. The O-ring engineers got the headlines, but there were plenty of us who felt like we could have done more, should have pushed harder for delays. That's why you became a mechanic. Frank slammed the truck's tailgate shut. Cars are simpler. When they break, usually only one person gets hurt. Kate studied his face, seeing now the intelligence behind the grease-stained exterior, the precision in movements she'd assumed were just the habits of a careful craftsman. Frank, the Morrison Foundation security system, it's military-grade encryption, if you could understand it, then we might actually have a chance of getting those records without triggering every alarm from here to Washington. Frank met her eyes. Yeah, I figured that out already. As they climbed into the truck, Kate realized that finding Frank hadn't been luck. In a world where her enemies had unlimited resources and political connections, she'd somehow stumbled onto exactly the kind of help she needed: a brilliant engineer who'd spent decades learning to be invisible. The truck rumbled to life with a sound like controlled thunder, and Frank pulled onto the back roads that would take them east toward Harvard. Neither of them spoke much during the first hour, both lost in their own thoughts about the road ahead, but Kate found herself glancing at Frank's hands on the steering wheel, noting the deliberate precision of his movements, the way he constantly checked his mirrors and adjusted their route to avoid main highways. This wasn't just a mechanic helping a stranger. This was a professional, coming out of retirement for one last mission. The back roads of Vermont and New Hampshire wound through a landscape painted in shades of gray and white, the storm's aftermath leaving everything crystalline and sharp. Frank kept them on the secondary highways, avoiding interstates and toll booths where cameras might catch their faces or license plates. Kate had been quiet for most of the journey, staring out the window at the passing countryside. Finally, she spoke. Frank, there's something else you should know about the Morrison Foundation. Frank glanced at her, noting the tension in her voice. What's that? It's not just about the money, Kate said slowly. It's about what that money was supposed to do. The research grants, they diverted some of them, were for breakthrough treatments, experimental therapies that could have saved lives. Could have? Kate's hands clenched in her lap. 3 months ago, a clinical trial for a new pediatric cancer treatment was suspended due to lack of funding. The researchers were 6 months away from FDA approval. Now those children... She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Frank felt something cold settle in his chest. How many children? The trial had 47 participants. Without the treatment, most of them have maybe a year. The truck's engine seemed to grow quieter, as if even it understood the weight of what Kate was saying. Frank thought about his own daughter, about the fight they'd lost, about all the family still fighting. Jesus, he whispered. The money they stole, Kate continued, it wasn't just numbers on a spreadsheet. It was hope. It was the difference between life and death for people who trusted them. Frank's grip tightened on the steering wheel. How long have you known? I've suspected for 2 years. But I only got proof 6 months ago when I started digging into the Foundation's partnership with overseas research facilities. That's when I found the shell companies, the redirected funds, the falsified reports. Why didn't you go to the authorities then? Kate's laugh was bitter. I tried. The Morrison family has connections everywhere: government, law enforcement, media. Every time I thought I'd found someone who would listen, the story got buried or discredited. That's when they started the Whisper campaign about my mental health. Frank processed this, thinking about the resources arrayed against them. So what makes you think Harvard will be different? Because the server at Harvard isn't connected to the Morrison network. My husband set it up as an independent academic archive, part of a research transparency initiative. The Foundation board doesn't even know it exists. And you think your brother-in-law doesn't know about it? Kate hesitated. David knows Michael was paranoid about data security, but Michael told everyone the backup system was destroyed after his death. Only I know it's still active. Frank nodded, but something nagged at him. Kate, if your husband suspected what was happening, why didn't he speak up? The silence that followed was so long, Frank thought she wasn't going to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Because I asked him not to. Frank pulled into a rest stop outside of Concord, New Hampshire, ostensibly for gas, but really to give Kate time to explain what she just revealed. They sat in the truck with the engine running, warm air from the heater creating a cocoon of relative comfort in the cold morning. 2 years ago, Kate began, staring at her hands. David came to me with an offer. He said the Foundation was facing a cash flow crisis, too many grant commitments, not enough liquid assets. He needed someone to temporarily redirect funds from the less urgent research programs to cover operational expenses. Frank waited, sensing there was more. He framed it as a choice between shutting down the Foundation entirely or making some hard decisions about priorities. Said it would only be for 6 months, just until some major donations came through. And you believed him? Kate's eyes flashed with self-directed anger. Michael was dying. The experimental treatment he was receiving, one that wasn't covered by insurance, cost $30,000 a month. David offered to cover all of Michael's medical expenses if I helped with the temporary restructuring. Frank felt pieces clicking into place. So you helped him move the money? I authorized the initial transfers, Kate admitted. I told myself it was just accounting, that the money would be returned once the Foundation stabilized. I even convinced Michael that it was the right thing to do. But the money never came back. Worse than that, after Michael died, I started reviewing the accounts and realized the redirected funds had been moved again offshore into investment vehicles that had nothing to do with medical research. When I confronted David, he told me I was mistaken, that grief was affecting my judgment. Frank studied her face. That's when you started digging deeper. That's when I realized I'd been played. The cash flow crisis was manufactured. The urgent operational expenses were fabricated. David had used my husband's illness to turn me into an accomplice. The weight of her confession settled between them like a physical presence. Frank understood now why Kate had been running instead of fighting. She wasn't just a whistleblower. She was a participant who discovered too late that she'd been manipulated. So when you went public with the evidence, Frank said slowly, David had ammunition to use against you. More than that, he had my digital signature on the authorization papers. He could claim I was the architect of the entire scheme, that my accusations were just an attempt to deflect blame after being caught. Frank leaned back in his seat, processing the complexity of Kate's situation. That's why they're calling you crazy instead of arresting you. They don't want a trial where evidence might come out. They just want you discredited and silenced. Kate nodded. But the server at Harvard has the original communication records, David's emails outlining the scheme, the falsified reports about the cash flow crisis, even recordings of meetings where he discussed using Michael's illness as leverage. With that evidence, I can prove I was coerced. Frank started the truck and pulled back onto the highway. Then let's go get it. As they drove, Frank found himself thinking about the moral complexity of Kate's situation. She'd made a deal with the devil to save her dying husband, and that devil had used her love against her. It was the kind of impossible choice that revealed as much about the system as it did about the individual. But it was also the kind of choice that, once exposed, could bring down that system entirely. Kate, Frank said as they crossed into Massachusetts, when we get to Harvard, we're not just gathering evidence against David Morrison, we're potentially destroying your entire family. Kate stared out at the winter landscape, her reflection ghost-like in the window. My family destroyed itself when they chose money over the mission. I'm just documenting the wreckage. Harvard University in winter was a study in contrasts, ancient brick buildings dusted with snow, modern glass structures reflecting the gray sky, students bundled in expensive coats hurrying between classes. Frank parked in a visitor lot, and they made their way across the campus toward the Countway Library of Medicine. Kate moved with the confidence of someone who belonged, using an alumni access card to get them through security. Frank followed, marveling at how different this world was from his garage in Vermont. Here, knowledge was currency, and the buildings themselves seemed to hum with the weight of accumulated learning. Michael taught here for 12 years, Kate explained as they navigated corridors lined with portraits of distinguished faculty. He was part of the medical ethics program, specializing in research transparency and patient advocacy. They reached a restricted area in the library's basement, where climate-controlled servers hummed behind locked doors. Kate produced another card, this one handmade, with a magnetic strip that looked like it had been programmed in someone's garage. Michael made this for me, she said, swiping the card through a reader that Frank would have sworn was installed aftermarket. He said if anything ever happened to him, I might need access to the archives. The lock clicked, and they entered a room that looked more like a high-tech bunker than a library storage area. Servers lined the walls, their status lights blinking in patterns that reminded Frank of mission control displays. In the center of the room sat a single workstation, its screens dark but ready. Kate powered up the system and began typing with the fluid precision of someone who'd done this many times before. The Morrison Foundation archive is stored on a completely separate network, she explained. Michael created it as part of his research into institutional accountability. It captures all electronic communications, financial records, even meeting recordings. Frank watched lines of code scroll across the screen, recognizing some of the security protocols from his NASA days. Your husband was paranoid. My husband understood that power corrupts, and that the people who most need watching are the ones who think they're above scrutiny. Kate's fingers flew over the keyboard. He said the only way to keep institutions honest was to make transparency automatic, built into the system at a level where it couldn't be turned off. The screen filled with folder icons labeled with dates and names. Kate navigated to a section marked Foundation Financial, Executive Communications, and began opening files. Here, she said, pointing to an email chain from 2 years earlier. David's initial proposal to me about the temporary restructuring. Frank read over her shoulder, his anger building with each line. The emails were coldly calculated, designed to present the fraudulent scheme as both necessary and temporary. More disturbing were the references to Michael's medical condition, with David explicitly stating that Kate's emotional state made her more amenable to cooperation. Son of a bitch, Frank muttered. Kate opened another file, audio recordings of board meetings, where the true nature of the financial diversions was discussed. David Morrison's voice was clear and unmistakable as he outlined plans to move research funds into more stable investment vehicles, with no intention of returning them to their original purpose. This is it, Kate said, her voice tight with emotion. This proves everything: the premeditated nature of the fraud, my coercion, the board's knowledge and approval. With this evidence, David can't claim I was the mastermind or that I'm making false accusations due to mental illness. Frank was about to respond when he noticed something on one of the other screens, a security monitor showing the library's entrance. 3 black SUVs had just pulled up outside. "Kate," he said quietly. She followed his gaze and went pale. "How did they find us?" Frank's mind raced through possibilities. Your access card probably has a tracker, or maybe the system logged your entry and sent an automatic alert. On the monitor, they could see men in suits entering the building. Kate's hands flew over the keyboard, copying files to a portable drive with desperate efficiency. "How long do we have?" she asked. Frank watched the figures disappear into the building. 5 minutes, maybe 10 if they have to search for us. I need 15 minutes to get everything. Frank made a decision that surprised him. Then you'll get 15 minutes. He stood and walked to the door. Keep copying. I'll buy you some time. Frank, you don't understand. These aren't mall cops. These are professionals. Frank's smile was grim. So am I. Frank positioned himself in the corridor outside the archive room, his back to the door where Kate worked frantically to download the evidence. He'd faced down enough bureaucrats and administrators in his NASA days to know how to handle authority figures. But his footsteps echoed down the hallway. He realized this situation required a different approach. David Morrison appeared first, flanked by 2 security operatives who moved with military precision. Behind them came someone Frank hadn't expected, an elderly woman in an expensive wool coat, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the winter weather. She carried herself with the bearing of someone accustomed to commanding rooms full of powerful people. Mr. Sullivan, Morrison said, his voice tight with controlled anger. I thought we had an understanding. Frank kept his expression neutral. About what? About my sister-in-law's location. She's clearly not well, and your interference is putting her in danger. The elderly woman stepped forward, studying Frank with sharp blue eyes that seemed to catalog everything about him in seconds. Mr. Sullivan, I'm Eleanor Morrison, David's mother, and Kate's mother-in-law. Frank felt the temperature in the corridor drop several degrees. Eleanor Morrison, he'd seen her name on hospital wings and research centers across New England. She was the foundation's founder, the family matriarch who'd built a pharmaceutical empire from a small-town pharmacy inherited from her father. Mrs. Morrison, Frank acknowledged. Eleanor's smile was polite but predatory. May I ask what interest a mechanic from Vermont has in our family affairs? May I ask what interest a medical foundation has in sending armed men to hunt down a grieving widow? Eleanor's eyebrows rose slightly at Frank's directness. Kate has been struggling since Michael's death. She's been making accusations that are not only false but potentially damaging to the foundation's ability to continue its vital work. We're concerned for her mental health. And if she's not crazy, then she's malicious, Eleanor said simply. Either way, she needs to be stopped. Frank heard the subtle shift in Eleanor's tone and realized he was no longer dealing with David Morrison's operation. This was something else entirely, a level of power and ruthlessness that made David look like a middle manager. Stopped how? Frank asked. Eleanor stepped closer, and Frank caught a whiff of expensive perfume mixed with something that reminded him of hospital antiseptic. Mr. Sullivan, the Morrison Foundation funds research that saves thousands of lives every year. What Kate is threatening to reveal would destroy not just our family, but decades of medical progress. Sometimes individual concerns must be weighed against the greater good. Even if those concerns are true, Eleanor's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. Truth is a luxury we can't always afford. Kate's accusations, even if they contained elements of accuracy, would trigger investigations that would shut down research programs worldwide. Children would die while bureaucrats sort through financial records. Is that really the outcome you want to support? Frank understood now that he'd stumbled into something far more complex than simple fraud. This wasn't just about stolen money. It was about an entire ecosystem of medical research that operated in moral gray areas, where the ends were used to justify means that couldn't bear scrutiny. What if there was a way to address Kate's concerns without destroying the foundation? Frank asked, playing for time. Eleanor's eyes sharpened with interest. What do you have in mind? Kate just wants the money returned to research programs. Maybe there's a way to do that quietly, without involving regulators or the media. David Morrison snorted. The money's been invested. It can't just be returned. But Eleanor held up a hand, silencing her son. Continue, Mr. Sullivan. Frank could hear Kate's fingers still flying over the keyboard behind the door. He needed more time. Kate's not looking for revenge. She's looking for justice. If the foundation committed to transparency reforms, independent auditing, maybe even Kate's involvement in oversight, Kate's involvement, David laughed bitterly. She's the one who authorized the initial transfers. She's as complicit as anyone. Eleanor shot her son a look that could have frozen the Charles River. David, perhaps you should wait in the car. David's face flushed with embarrassment and anger, but he didn't argue. As he stalked away, Eleanor turned back to Frank with renewed attention. You're more perceptive than I gave you credit for, Mr. Sullivan. Yes, Kate was involved in the initial financial restructuring, but she was also manipulated. Her grief and desperation used against her. David lacks the subtlety for such operations. Frank felt pieces clicking into place. You're the one who orchestrated it. Eleanor's smile was sharp as a scalpel. I've been managing this foundation for 40 years. Mr. Sullivan, I've navigated recessions, regulatory changes, political upheavals, and medical breakthroughs that threatened to render our entire research model obsolete. When Kate's husband became ill, I saw an opportunity to solve a genuine cash flow problem while creating a useful scapegoat if the transaction was ever discovered. You used your dying son-in-law to manipulate his wife. I used available resources to ensure the foundation's survival. Michael understood this. He approved the archive system specifically because he knew institutional memory would be important if questions were ever raised. Frank stared at her, recognizing a level of cold calculation that made David look like an amateur. He knew you were planning to frame Kate. Michael knew that sometimes good people have to make difficult choices for the greater good. He created the archive to ensure that if Kate ever needed to defend herself, she'd have the tools to do so. But he also knew that those same tools could be used to demonstrate her complicity. The sound of typing had stopped behind the door. Either Kate had finished, or she'd heard enough of the conversation to understand the depth of the trap they'd walked into. Eleanor seemed to sense the change as well. Mr. Sullivan, I'm going to make you the same offer I'm prepared to make Kate. Walk away now. And this ends quietly. The foundation continues its work. Kate receives the medical care she clearly needs, and you return to your peaceful life in Vermont. And if I refuse, Eleanor's expression didn't change, but something deadly flickered behind her eyes. Then you'll discover that the Morrison family didn't build a medical empire by being sentimental about obstacles. The corridor fell silent except for the distant hum of the library's ventilation system. Frank stared at Eleanor Morrison, seeing in her lined face the kind of focused ruthlessness that built empires and crushed anyone who stood in the way. But there was something else he needed to know, something that had been nagging at him since Kate first mentioned the diverted research funds. Mrs. Morrison, Frank said carefully, the pediatric cancer trial that was suspended, what was it called? Eleanor's eyes narrowed. Why would that matter to a mechanic? Because mechanics have families too, and sometimes those families get cancer. Eleanor studied his face, and Frank saw the moment she decided to indulge what she assumed was mere curiosity. The Pemberton-Hayes Protocol, an experimental treatment for pediatric brain tumors. Very promising, but prohibitively expensive to continue without foundation support. Frank felt the world tilt around him. Pemberton-Hayes, he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. You're familiar with it. Frank closed his eyes for a moment, seeing again the hospital room, the machines, The hope in a little girl's eyes as doctors explained the new experimental treatment that might save her life. The treatment that had been discontinued just weeks before she would have qualified. My daughter, Frank said quietly. Sarah. She died 18 months ago. Glioblastoma. Leonor's expression didn't change, but Frank caught something flickering behind her eyes, not guilt, but calculation. I'm sorry for your loss. Mr. Sullivan, pediatric brain cancer is a particularly cruel disease. She was supposed to enter the Pemberton Hayes trial, Frank continued, his voice growing stronger. We'd been waiting for months for a slot to open up. The doctors said it was her best chance, maybe her only chance. Clinical trials have limited spaces. The trial was suspended. Frank cut her off. Not because it wasn't working, but because the funding was pulled. My daughter died 3 weeks later. The silence that followed was pregnant with implications. Frank saw Eleanor processing this new information, weighing how to use it to her advantage. Mr. Sullivan, she said finally, I understand your pain, but destroying the foundation won't bring your daughter back. It will only ensure that other children suffer the same fate. Frank's laugh was bitter. Other children are already suffering because you stole their funding. The funding was redirected to ensure the foundation's long-term stability. Those research programs would have been discontinued anyway if the foundation had collapsed. That's not your decision to make. Frank's voice echoed down the corridor, and he realized his composure was cracking. 18 months of suppressed grief and rage were threatening to spill over, but he forced himself to stay focused. Behind the door, Kate was still gathering evidence. He needed to keep Eleanor talking. You're right, Eleanor said, her tone becoming almost motherly. It wasn't my decision alone. It was a board decision, made collectively by people who understood the broader implications. But I can see how that might not matter to a grieving father. Frank studied her face, looking for any trace of genuine emotion. Do you have children, Mrs. Morrison? 3 sons, 2 daughters, 11 grandchildren. Ever lose one? Eleanor's mask slipped for just a moment. My youngest son, leukemia, 23 years ago. Frank felt some of his anger deflate, replaced by a more complex emotion. Then you know. I know that grief can make people do desperate things. I know that the need to blame someone for the unblameable can drive rational people to irrational acts. Eleanor stepped closer. But I also know that the work we do here matters. The research we fund saves lives. The treatments we develop today prevent the tragedies of tomorrow. Built on stolen money, built on reallocated resources. The distinction matters. Mr. Sullivan, we didn't steal money to buy yachts or mansions. We redirected funds from less promising research to more stable investments that would ensure the foundation's long-term viability. Frank shook his head. You redirected funds from children who were dying. We redirected funds from research that might have helped some children to investments that would ensure we could help many more children in the future. The door behind Frank clicked open. Kate emerged, a USB drive clutched in her hand and an expression on her face that suggested she'd heard most of the conversation. Hello, Eleanor, Kate said quietly. Eleanor's demeanor shifted subtly, becoming warmer but somehow more dangerous. Kate, dear, you look tired. I am tired. Tired of running. Tired of being called crazy. Tired of watching you destroy everything Michael believed in? Michael understood the complexities of institutional management better than you give him credit for. Kate held up the USB drive. I have his recordings. Eleanor. All of them. Including the ones where he talks about what you did to manipulate me and how he created the archive system specifically to expose your fraud. Eleanor's eyes fixed on the drive like a predator watching prey. Kate, you don't understand the full picture. That drive contains sensitive information about ongoing research programs, proprietary methodologies, confidential patient data. Releasing it would violate dozens of privacy laws and destroy lives across the medical research community. I understand enough, Kate replied. I understand that you used my husband's death to turn me into an accomplice. I understand that you've stolen money meant to save children like Frank's daughter. And I understand that you're willing to destroy anyone who threatens to expose the truth. Frank watched the interchange with growing awareness that this confrontation had been building for years. Kate and Eleanor weren't just family members on opposite sides of a financial scandal. They were two people with fundamentally different views of how power should be exercised and what responsibilities came with it. "What do you want?" Eleanor asked finally. Kate straightened her shoulders. "I want the stolen money returned to research programs. I want independent oversight of all foundation finances. I want you to step down from any operational role, and I want a public acknowledgement of what was done to me and why." Eleanor considered this for a long moment. "And if I refuse," Kate gestured toward Frank, "then Frank and I take this evidence to the FBI, the SEC, the state attorney general, and every medical journal in the country. We let them sort out the truth. That would destroy the foundation. Then don't refuse." Eleanor Morrison stared at Kate for a long moment, then did something neither Frank nor Kate expected. She laughed. Not the bitter laugh of defeat, but something warmer and more genuine. "You know, Kate, you remind me of myself at your age. Righteous, determined, convinced that the world could be fixed if only people would do the right thing." She walked to a nearby window and gazed out at the Harvard campus, where students moved between buildings like antibodies in a vast organism. 40 years ago, I stood in a hospital room watching my youngest son die from leukemia. The doctors told me there was an experimental treatment in Germany, but it wasn't approved here, and insurance wouldn't cover it. Do you know what I did? Kate and Frank waited. I sold everything. The family house, my jewelry, even my first husband's prized car collection. I liquidated assets, called in favors, and moved heaven and earth to get Thomas into that trial. Eleanor's voice grew quiet. It didn't work. He died anyway. But that experience taught me something important about the difference between what's right and what's necessary. She turned back to face them. When I founded the Morrison Medical Foundation, I swore that no family would ever face the choices I faced. We would fund research, support trials, and ensure that promising treatments wouldn't die for lack of resources. For 40 years, that's exactly what we've done. By stealing money from other research programs, Kate said, by making difficult choices about resource allocation. Kate, the pediatric trial your friend here mentioned, we didn't cancel it out of greed. We canceled it because the preliminary results weren't promising enough to justify the expense. The money we saved by ending that trial was redirected to 3 other programs that have since produced breakthrough treatments. Frank felt his anger rekindling. You don't know that the trial wouldn't have worked? You're right, Eleanor agreed. I don't know, but I do know that the resources we saved have already saved hundreds of lives. Sometimes, Mr. Sullivan, leadership means making choices based on probability rather than possibility. Kate shook her head. That's not your decision to make, Eleanor. Families should have the right to hope, even if the odds are long. Eleanor's expression grew sad. Hope is a luxury. Kate, resources are finite. Every dollar spent on a long-shot treatment is a dollar not spent on research with better odds of success. The mathematics of life and death aren't democratic. Frank found himself struggling with the complexity of Eleanor's argument. As an engineer, he understood efficiency and resource allocation, but as a father who'd watched his daughter die, he also understood the desperate need to try everything, no matter how unlikely. There's something else you should know, Eleanor continued, reaching into her coat pocket. Before you decide whether to destroy the foundation, she pulled out a manila envelope and handed it to Kate. My medical records from Massachusetts General, stage 4 pancreatic cancer, diagnosed 3 months ago. Kate opened the envelope, scanning the documents inside. Frank saw her face go pale. I have perhaps 6 months left, Eleanor said calmly, which means I have 6 months to ensure the foundation survives my death. The board of directors is already positioning themselves for a power struggle once I'm gone. David lacks the vision to hold things together. Without strong leadership, The foundation will fragment into competing fiefdoms, each protecting their own research interests. She looked directly at Kate. I didn't manipulate you 2 years ago just to solve a cash flow problem. I did it to test whether you had the strength to eventually take over the foundation. Frank stared at Eleanor, recognizing the cold brilliance of her plan. You're dying? So you want Kate to replace you? I want Kate to save the foundation from itself. She has the technical knowledge to understand our research programs, the moral authority to implement reforms, and now, thanks to this archive, the leverage to force necessary changes. Kate clutched the USB drive tighter. By becoming complicit in fraud, by becoming educated about the realities of institutional power, Kate, you can take that drive to the authorities and watch them spend 3 years investigating while research programs shut down and children die. Or you can use it as leverage to reform the system from within. Eleanor stepped closer to Kate, her voice becoming urgent. I know what I've done looks monstrous from the outside, but the foundation funds research at 47 universities, supports 1,200 clinical trials, and provides grants to researchers who couldn't get funding anywhere else. Destroying it would be a greater crime than anything you can accuse me of. Frank watched Kate struggle with the impossible choice Eleanor was offering. He could see her weighing justice against pragmatism, punishment against prevention. What exactly are you proposing? Kate asked finally. Eleanor smiled, and Frank caught a glimpse of the formidable woman who'd built a medical empire from nothing. You become my successor. I'll announce my illness publicly and name you as interim director, with full authority to implement whatever reforms you think necessary. The board won't dare oppose a dying woman's final wishes, especially when you have evidence of their complicity. And in return, the archive remains sealed. David and the others face internal discipline rather than criminal prosecution, and the foundation continues its work with whatever safeguards you implement. Kate looked at Frank, seeking his counsel. What do you think Frank thought about his daughter, about the trial that might have saved her, about all the other children who might benefit from the foundation's research if it survived? He thought about justice and pragmatism, about the difference between what felt right and what might actually help. I think, Frank said slowly, that sometimes the best way to fight monsters is to become one yourself, but only if you can remember why you started fighting in the first place. Eleanor nodded approvingly. Spoken like a true engineer. You understand that complex problems require complex solutions. Kate stared at the USB drive in her hand, evidence that could destroy the foundation or reform it, depending on how she chose to use it. If I agree to this, I want complete transparency about past activities. I want independent auditing of all financial decisions. And I want a patients' rights advocate on the board with veto power over research priority decisions. Done, Eleanor said immediately. And I want Frank on the board too. Eleanor's eyebrows rose. A mechanic on the board of a medical foundation, a systems engineer with expertise in institutional accountability, Kate corrected. Someone who understands how to build safeguards into complex organizations. And Frank started to protest, but Eleanor cut him off. Actually, that's not a bad idea. Fresh perspective, no conflicts of interest, relevant technical expertise. She looked at Frank. What do you say, Mr. Sullivan, ready to come out of retirement? Frank thought about the quiet life he'd built in Vermont, about the peace he'd found in working with his hands instead of his mind. Then he thought about Sarah, about all the children who might benefit from better managed research, about the chance to build something that might actually work. I suppose, Frank said, that someone should keep an eye on you people. Eleanor's laugh was sharp with genuine amusement. Indeed, indeed they should. 6 months later, Frank stood in the boardroom of the Morrison Medical Foundation, looking out through floor-to-ceiling windows at Boston Harbor. The room itself had changed since Eleanor's death. The intimidating oil paintings of Morrison patriarchs had been replaced with photographs of children who'd benefited from foundation research. And the massive conference table had been downsized to encourage more collaborative discussions. Kate entered carrying a stack of quarterly reports. Her appearance transformed from the desperate fugitive he'd found in his shed. She wore a sharp business suit but had kept her hair shorter than the corporate norm, a subtle reminder that she wasn't interested in playing by traditional rules. "The Pemberton Hayes trial results are in," she said, setting the reports on the table. Frank looked up from the financial statements he'd been reviewing, and Kate's smile was cautious but genuine. 63% response rate in the pediatric cohort. It's going to phase 3 trials with full FDA expedited review. Frank felt something loosen in his chest, a knot of grief and guilt he'd carried since Sarah's death. "How many children?" "The expanded trial will include 400 participants across 12 medical centers. If the results hold, it could become standard treatment within 18 months. Frank nodded, thinking about the complex chain of events that had led to this moment. Eleanor's death had been both an ending and a beginning. The foundation had mourned its formidable founder, while embracing Kate's reforms with surprising enthusiasm. The independent auditing system Frank had designed was revealing inefficiencies and opportunities that even Eleanor's sharp mind had missed. "David's not happy about the transparency requirements," Kate continued, settling into the chair across from him. "David's never happy about anything that requires him to think beyond the next quarter," Frank replied. "How's he adjusting to his new role?" Kate's laugh was rueful. "Head of Community Relations suits him better than CEO. He's actually quite good at talking to donor families and medical researchers. It turns out his problem wasn't incompetence. It was being put in positions that required more vision than he possessed." Frank understood. He'd seen similar situations in aerospace, where talented engineers were promoted into management roles that didn't match their skills. And the board, surprisingly supportive. Once they realized that transparency actually makes fundraising easier, they became enthusiastic converts. Donors trust us more when they can see exactly where their money goes. Frank picked up one of the reports, a detailed breakdown of research investments and outcomes that would have made Eleanor proud despite its radical transparency. "Speaking of donors, how's the Sarah Sullivan Memorial Fund doing?" Kate's expression softened. Sarah's fund had been Frank's first initiative as a board member, a program specifically designed to support long-shot research projects that traditional funding mechanisms overlooked. It wasn't large by foundation standards, but it had already funded 3 promising early-stage trials. "We're oversubscribed," Kate reported. "Apparently, there are a lot of people who believe in supporting hope even when the odds are long." Frank nodded, thinking about the letters he'd received from families whose children had entered trials funded by Sarah's memorial. The mathematics of life and death might not be democratic, but that didn't mean democracy shouldn't have a voice in the equation. "There's something else," Kate said, her tone becoming more serious. "I've been thinking about Eleanor's offer to seal the archive permanently." Frank looked up. In the months since Eleanor's death, they'd used the evidence in the archive selectively enough to force reforms and remove a few problematic board members, but not enough to trigger the kind of investigation that would shut down the foundation entirely. "And I think it's time to make the full archive public, not immediately and not without preparation, but eventually. The foundation is strong enough now to survive scrutiny, and other medical organizations could benefit from studying our failures as well as our successes." Frank considered this. That would destroy David's career, probably land him in prison. Maybe, or maybe it would give him a chance to take responsibility for his actions and contribute to ensuring this kind of thing doesn't happen elsewhere. People can surprise you when you give them the opportunity to do the right thing. Frank thought about his own journey from bitter exile to engaged board member, about Kate's transformation from complicit victim to institutional reformer. Eleanor would have hated the idea. Eleanor was brilliant and ruthless and probably saved thousands of lives through her leadership. But she was also wrong about some things. Transparency isn't a luxury, it's a necessity, and accountability isn't punishment, it's education. Frank smiled, recognizing in Kate's words the voice of someone who'd learned to wield power responsibly. "When do you want to start the process?" "Next year. Give David and the others time to prepare. give our reforms time to prove themselves, and give the research community time to understand that this is about making things better, not tearing things down. Frank nodded. And us, what happens to the mechanic and the whistleblower after they've reformed the medical establishment? Kate's laugh was warm with genuine affection. I suppose we go back to Vermont and figure out what other institutions need fixing. Frank looked out at the harbor again, watching cargo ships navigate between islands that had been there for millennia. You know, I never thanked you. For what? For knocking on my door in a snowstorm? For giving me a reason to stop hiding from the world? Kate reached across the table and squeezed his hand, the gesture of a friend, not a colleague. I never thanked you either, for opening that door, for reminding me that sometimes the best way to find justice is to build it yourself. Frank squeezed back, thinking about the long journey from that desperate night in Vermont to this moment of quiet satisfaction in Boston. Think we've built something that will last? Kate looked around the boardroom, then out at the harbor where the setting sun painted the water in shades of gold and amber. I think we've built something that can adapt, which might be even better. As they gathered their papers and prepared to leave, Frank found himself thinking about Sarah, about the children who would benefit from the Pemberton Hayes trial, about all the future discoveries that would be possible because two unlikely allies had chosen transparency over expediency. It wasn't the kind of justice he'd imagined when Kate first showed him that laptop full of evidence, but it was something more sustainable, a system designed to correct itself rather than hide its mistakes. Outside, snow was beginning to fall again, but it felt different now, not like the desperate storm that had driven Kate to his door, but like the gentle blessing of a world that still believed in second chances. Frank and Kate walked out into the winter evening together. Two people who'd learned that sometimes the best way to fight institutions was to rebuild them from within, one ethical decision at a time. Behind them, the Morrison Medical Foundation hummed with quiet purpose, its lights burning late into the night as researchers and administrators worked together on projects that might change the world transparently, accountably, and with the kind of hope that survives even the longest odds. The story that had begun with a knock on a shed door in the middle of a snowstorm had become something larger than either Frank or Kate could have imagined, not just a tale of personal redemption, but a blueprint for how broken systems could be healed by people willing to do the hard work of building something better. And in hospitals across the country, children who might otherwise have lost hope were entering clinical trials funded by an organization that had learned to balance efficiency with humanity, progress with accountability, and institutional power with individual dignity. It was, Frank thought as he and Kate parted ways in the parking garage, exactly the kind of ending Sarah would have approved of, not perfect, but honest, and full of the possibility that tomorrow might be better than today. The snow continued to fall, covering the city in a blanket of clean white possibility, as Frank drove north toward Vermont and the quiet life that was no longer quite so quiet, but infinitely more meaningful than it had been before a stranger knocked on his door in the middle of the night. Sometimes, he reflected, the most important decisions we make are the ones that seem smallest at the time, the choice to help a stranger, to listen to an impossible story, to believe that broken things can still be fixed. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, those small decisions turn out to change everything. In the end, they didn't tear down the empire. They rebuilt it, brick by brick, choice by choice, with the kind of patient courage that changes the world quietly. Frank Sullivan learned that hiding from the past doesn't heal it, only facing it does. Kate Morrison discovered that sometimes the best way to honor the dead is to fight for the living. And Eleanor Morrison, in her final act, proved that even the most ruthless among us can choose redemption over reputation. The children entering those clinical trials will never know the mechanic who opened his door to a stranger in a snowstorm. They'll never hear about the woman who chose transparency over safety, or the dying matriarch who used her last breath to build something better than what she'd destroyed. But their lives will be saved by decisions made in darkness, by people who understood that sometimes the smallest acts of courage echo the longest. What storms have knocked on your door? And when they did,